Hello and welcome. I'm Jessica Cherry, host of the ReImagination Café Podcast, and this is a special supplement to our podcast episode number 14, Cultivating Change, the Transformative Power of Care Farming. So often when I produce podcast episodes, in addition to having conversations with my primary guests, as part of my research, I have conversations with other people who can help me increase my understanding of the topic we're covering. That helps me to ask better questions and ultimately to create a better podcast. And oftentimes I incorporate those conversations into the episode. So in this case, to enable me to bring the care farming concept to life for my listeners, I felt it was important to talk to various people who are running care farm programs. And so Kate Mudge from the Care Farming Network was kind enough to introduce me to Lacey and Adam Ingrao. They operate Bee-Wise farms in Michigan, where they integrate mindfulness practices and beekeeping and have done a lot of really great work with veterans. Adam himself is a fourth-generation veteran. And what was supposed to be a relatively short conversation with Adam and Lacey to give me a general understanding of what Bee-Wise Farms is all about turned into something more. And while I was able to incorporate much of that conversation into the podcast episode, there was a lot that, due to timing constraints, got left out. So we've created this supplemental track for anyone interested in learning more about Adam and Lacey and Bee-Wise Farms, including the role of honeybees in our agricultural systems, the work that Adam and Lacey are currently doing with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and how they weave their backgrounds and experiences into the work they do. So here's that full conversation. I really hope you enjoy it. Lacey, Adam, thanks so much for sitting down with me for this conversation about Bee-Wise Farms and the therapeutic benefits of beekeeping.
Thank you so much for having us. We're really honored.
Happy to be here to speak with y'all.
So to start us off, can you provide us with an overview of Bee-Wise Farms?
Yeah, well, Bee-Wise Farms started 10 years ago, and we initially started in the Lansing area of Michigan, and 2018 we shifted to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where we're at now in Newberry. And we're a small, diversified farm. We run about 40 acres here, primarily focused on honeybees, wellness related to connection with nature. We do maple syrup as well, variety of vegetables, flowers, but our main crop that we grow in addition to honey and maple syrup is lavender. We do a lot with lavender and other herbs. We do tea blends and things like that. We have a small farm stand here. We used to have a farm store, which we just retired this year, and we're transitioning that building to another effort that we're working on now, which is apitherapy. So we also offer apitherapy services such as venom therapy, air therapy with bees, vibrational therapy, so acoustic therapy, and there's a lot of somatic movement around bees as well.
So I want to talk about the benefits of beekeeping on mental health, wellness, and human connection. But first, Adam, can you explain at a high level the impact of bees, and in particular honeybees, on crop yield?
Honeybees are a really important part of our agricultural systems. About a third of the food that we eat is due to insect pollination, and that's largely due to managed honeybees, because when we think about crop pollination, you have to have crop pollination at a certain time. Like apples only bloom at a certain time of the year, and you need to have an insect that can pollinate those plants pretty much on demand. And that's where honeybees really come in. They're not native to North America, and we do have a huge suite of native bees, but a lot of the crops that we rely on for food production are introduced crops. So the bloom times don't often align with native pollinators. And so you need to have honeybees in order to get that big push of pollinators in one space to get good fruit set. And I think probably the biggest example that we have in the United States of how important honeybees are is almond pollination in California, where Lacey and I are originally from. The Central Valley of California produces about 80% of the almonds in the world, and 80% of our honeybees in the United States all go to almond pollination in the early part of the year, usually right around February. If it weren't for honeybees, we would not have almonds. So they play a really important role in our pollination of our crops.
Well, that is a fun fact I didn't know. And now every time I eat almonds, I will be thinking of the honeybees. So thank you for that. And now getting into the therapeutic benefits of beekeeping, Lacey, why don't we turn to you?
So we know nature-based therapies have a huge benefit on our mental wellness, our body wellness, our ability to transition from world to world, right? Being out in nature to coming back into our daily life. And working with bees has a tremendous effect on the ability for mindfulness. And that's something that we practice heavily here at the farm ourselves, as well as anybody coming onto the farm, to simply come and be with them in a way that allows us to settle our brains, come into the body, be more mindful with not only nature, not only the bees, but also our partners, our children, our family. And that is really the main benefit about working with bees, the ability to increase mindfulness and allow us to really tap into some of the things that we're always working through in our brains and allow us to come back into our hearts and into our bodies.
And it's fairly counterintuitive, right? Most people, when they think of bees, their heart rate goes up and they think, get me out of here. I don't want to get stung.
One of the things that I take from working with bees all the time is when I'm in the apiary, if I'm not being mindful, if I'm not being present, they're going to let you know by getting a little more aggressive, maybe stinging you. If we come into the apiary with the mindset that there is this imminent threat of potentially being stung, it can force us to be mindful. And so when we get in those spaces where we're not being careful with the bees, where we're not being present with them, we're maybe being a little sloppy with our hive handling, the bees are going to let you know.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a reminder that, hey, you need to come back. You need to be present with me. We need to be together in this moment. And so those moments in the apiary can be critical times for self-reflection. They can be critical times for really being present. And it is very counterintuitive. You oftentimes think of like being around millions of bees is going to be really stressful. When in actuality, when you really start to become present with those bees, it can be one of the most therapeutic and most meditative experiences that you can possibly do.
Yeah. And then how does that mindfulness transition out of the apiary and into our lives?
And Lacey, I know that your background is very much tied to mindfulness. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my educational background is in transpersonal psychology. I graduated from a school out of Colorado called Naropa University, and it's a contemplative-based university. So everything is mindfulness-based. Everything is how do we be as mindful in every action of our lives? And that has really been brought forth into what we're doing in Beewise Farms. Before that, I have about 2 decades worth of somatic therapy and yoga therapy. And so that is also included in how we work with our bodies, and especially in the apiary, because it can be quite intense on the body.
What is it about the bees in particular that makes them so therapeutic? Is it the way they engage your senses?
I think that's exactly what it is. It activates all of the senses. When you walk into a bee yard, you have the ability to feel them, to taste what they offer, to hear everything that they offer. The sound of the bees in our therapeutic house, that sound therapy is critical, and it almost brings an immediate calmness to the nervous system. It accentuates the awareness of all of our senses as we're walking in, as we're even just sitting in the field with a lavender plant and all of the bees are buzzing around. But to walk into a building where beehives are there, it is truly impactful to the senses. And that sensory work is everything when it comes to mindfulness.
And this idea of using bees as therapy is not a new idea, right? Adam, I've heard you talk about how prevalent these practices are in Eastern Europe, for example.
I had the fortune of going to Slovenia last year to work with beekeepers there, and that country has the highest population per capita of beekeepers. 1 in every 200 people is a beekeeper.
Oh my goodness.
They really use bees as a part not only of beekeeping and all of the traditional things that we do bees for, honey, pollination, propolis, wax, all those types of things. But that is where this idea of bee houses comes from. So they have what they call chebelniaks, which are bee houses that people go in for therapy. And so when I was in Slovenia, we were literally going into these bee houses where people are coming in for asthma therapy. So they hook you up to a breathing mask that is attached to a beehive because the aromas of a beehive can actually help with respiratory problems. So that is one aspect of it, just the air therapy. But that acoustic therapy, bees, the sound is the sound of sea. It really allows you to calm the nervous system tremendously. So in many of these bee houses, you have beehives that are lined up against a wall, and you have a bed that's right next to them that people will lay on for acoustic therapy. And they take that very far. I had the great fortune of staying in a commercial beekeeper's chateau that had 70 beehives on the first floor of the chateau. And then the second floor was bedrooms with holes in the floor so that the smells from those 70 beehives were actually coming up into the bedroom, so that when you slept in this place, you were immersed in the sounds and the smells of bees.
I love that story.
Oh my goodness. Can I tell you just how refreshed you feel coming out of a sleep with bees. It's tremendous. And so these are not new things that we're talking about. These are well-established things, but here in the United States, honeybees have been treated as livestock since the importation in 1622 of European bees. And the European approach to managing honeybees from Europeans in America has been very much so like livestock. And in the last 150 years, that has changed tremendously. And now we move bees around the country all the time. There's a tremendous amount of stress that goes along with that to the organism itself. And we've kind of lost this idea of using bees as a modality of health. And that's what we're trying to recapture. We're trying to recapture this idea that bees are much more important than we give them credit for. And if you look at the ancient profile of honeybees, beekeeping as an endeavor has been going on for 4,500 years and started in ancient Egypt. When we look at the ancient cultures and how they revered bees, bees were gifts from the gods. They were not seen as just an average livestock. They were actually a connection to the divine. And so this is something that for millennia was the practice, that bees were these really special organisms within nature that humans have this really unusual connection with, because what other insect do we have a connection with like we do with honeybees? We don't. And so that's really what this is all about. This idea of therapy and bees is really just recapturing ancient knowledge and really trying to bring that into the modern day.
That is just incredible. One of the things that's really stood out to me in producing this podcast is just how far back so many of these practices go. And of course, there's so much for us to draw from today. So I want to talk about the program you've created, your Be Calm, Be Well program, where you integrate mindfulness practices and beekeeping at BeeWise farms. And I know you've gotten some really great results.
Yeah, we started working on this probably about 7, 8 years ago, where we started actually developing practices with bees that integrate mindfulness practices or integrate yoga, meditation, or traditional breathing practices, or things that people do in their daily lives that we felt that we could incorporate with bees to actually bring people closer to honeybees. And we ended up partnering with the Department of Veterans Affairs to develop a suite of these practices. We have 10 practices now that we have developed. We did research with the VA on them, and what we saw was a 30% reduction in depression and anxiety of individuals that were participating in these programs at a VA hospital. We published a peer-reviewed paper on it in 2024 that is the first in an English-based journal that demonstrates that using mindfulness practices in conjunction with beekeeping can actually increase dramatically the health benefits of individuals that are using those practices.
And I know you've been partnering with the Department of Veterans Affairs to train their clinical staff and professional beekeeping educators so that they can incorporate those practices into the work they do with veterans through, I believe you call it their VA Hives program.
That particular program now has about, I think it's 7 locations around the United States, 7 VA hospitals that actually have bees on site that are using these wellness practices for veterans that are dealing with things like post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, and utilizing these practices to help them deal with those maladies. And it's been wildly successful. We just held a conference at the beginning of September and had over 250 people that came to the conference. We had a professional development series with that I think we had about 80 clinicians and professional beekeepers that have now been trained in these practices so that they can bring them out to their communities and start using this as a way to help their community members.
Amazing. So Adam, you are a 4th-generation U.S. Army veteran and a staunch advocate for agriculture training programs for veterans. You've even testified before the Michigan legislature and the U.S. Senate. Can you share a bit about your own background, including your service and transition to civilian life, some of the challenges you and other veterans face, and the benefits of beekeeping for veterans specifically?
Absolutely. So my journey to beekeeping really began after military service. So I served post 9/11. I got out in 2004. I was active duty Army. I was a Patriot missile fire controller and got hurt during training. And the injury that I had was severe enough to where I couldn't be deployed. So I was given a medical discharge from the Army. When I got out of the Army, it was the height of the opioid epidemic. And so for my injuries, I was being prescribed a heavy dose of opiates. And that became a bit of a problem for me. When I met Lacey in 2005, I was pretty regularly using alcohol and opiates just to make it through the day. We had a conversation, Lacey and I, at one point about me potentially using my GI Bill to go back to school. And so I had always worked in agriculture. I started working on farms when I was 14 years old. And so I had a real affinity for agriculture. And so I decided I was going to go back to school and get a degree in plant science. And so I quit my job, which was pretty stressful at the time, but quit my job and went back to school full time. And I ended up going to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo out in Central California.
And that's where you discovered beekeeping, right?
I took a beekeeping class as an elective. And it was the first time since I'd left the military that I really felt like, one, there was something that I could do to continue to serve my nation. By serving as a beekeeper, you are managing the most important managed pollinator on the planet that is really important to our food security as a nation. And that really spoke to me. The other thing that really spoke to me, and I remember it vividly, that first time being in the bee yard with 60 hives, hundreds of thousands of bees all around me, it was the first time where I actually felt like I had to be mindful. I was still fresh out of the military, still thinking about my battle buddies that were overseas fighting Iraq and Afghanistan, thinking about the ones that never came home and dealing with the survivor's guilt that's part of leaving the military and leaving that family that you have. And the bees really forced me to be present and not be thinking about those things. And it was really at that moment where I changed my entire focus from plant science to entomology. And so I ended up working with the entomologist at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, in addition to the beekeeper that was at Cal Poly, for the rest of my time there. And that resulted in me pursuing a PhD in entomology at Michigan State later on. And so during the time I was at Michigan State is when we started the Heroes to Hives program 10 years ago. And Lacey had brought up this idea of other veterans, maybe they could benefit from the same thing that I had with bees, because bees really transformed my entire life.
So I want to back up just a bit. Adam, you mentioned that dark period that you experienced after your medical discharge. Could you talk for a moment about some of the challenges veterans face during that transition from military service, where everything is very structured, to civilian life, when oftentimes there's no structure, and for many, not a whole lot of support?
When you leave the military, it is like falling off of a cliff. You leave your family, you leave the men and women that were standing by your side, that were willing to lay their lives down for you, and you go back home. And I was stationed in Texas, and I'm from California. So I was 20 hours away from my military family. And so that's pretty regular for a lot of folks. And luckily, I had a family to go home to. I had a lot of battle buddies that didn't have families to go home to. And so when you go through that transitional process, if there's not a support system in place for you when you get home, this is what causes a lot of men and women to take their lives out of the military, because it is like falling off of a cliff. And people say, well, you're out of the military, you can do anything you want. Well, that sounds great, but I've been told what to do for years, and I've had to show up and be accountable to people who I care about and I respect. And now I have none of that. I have to show up for myself. And that's really difficult to motivate yourself, especially when you're dealing with disabilities. I was 25 years old, a fit, really strong individual who all of a sudden now has an injury that I'm dealing with for the rest of my life. And just that alone is really tough to come to terms with. And so those are some of the main challenges that we as veterans face as we're coming home. That what's the next mission? And for me, it was bees. When I found them, that was the next mission. Previous to that, I was pretty much just trying to find something that spoke to me. And a lot of that stuff was just filler in the time to find what my purpose really was and what really spoke to me. And bees and that national service piece really came through for me.
And you mentioned your Heroes to Hives program earlier, which you and Lacey developed about a decade ago, where you've used beekeeping to help many other veterans through that transition.
When we decided to do Heroes to Hives, we realized the impact so very quickly. One of the wives of the participants approached me at some point at the end of the first year and told us that the program saved his life. And we realized how impactful this program could be, but also just being in the presence of beekeeping and being in the presence of bees and using those mindfulness tools, how impactful they can be off the farm and in our daily lives.
One of the things I've heard you talk about when discussing Heroes to Hives and beekeeping more generally is the important role that beekeeping and being on a farm can play in bringing families together, and just how important that is for veterans who have often spent a lot of time away from their families.
One of the most important things that we've seen from our program is that because we allow family members to participate, that veteran that may be distant from their family, veterans that have served, and especially those that have served in combat. I have friends that served 5 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they were gone for years, meaning that their kids were being raised and growing up during this time where they were gone. And those familial bonds get really strained between spouses, between children, because of your absence. And then when you come back from combat, you are not the same person. The things you've done, the things you've seen, the things you've experienced change you fundamentally. And it may be something as simple as just changing your mindset, but it also could be as fundamental as a traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress, which really change the individual. And so what beekeeping allows this to do when we bring the family together is allows the family to bond around a common interest, around something that everybody's interested in doing together. And it really allows people to kind of come together around these honeybees.
So you're building community.
It's really spectacular, Jessica. Over the years that we've been doing this, over the decade that we've been doing this type of work, every year when we're doing on-ground training, it always starts at the beginning of the year with everybody so focused on the bees and learning the bees. But by the end of the year, by the end of the field season, the conversations that we start having in the bee yard tend to drift away from honeybees. And it may be something that someone's feeling comfortable enough to open up with because they've been with these people now for 6 months and they've developed a relationship with this community. And now they're willing to open up with something that may be a little harder to talk about than they would with their family or even with a psychologist, because a lot of us feel like some of the things that we've done don't reflect us. There's a lot of moral injury, and sharing those experiences with a stranger can be really tough. And so, I mean, I've had conversations with service members about pretty horrific things that they've seen or had to do or are dealing with in the bee yard because they feel like they can connect and they can open up in that space.
That's such a lovely example of the sense of community and the safe spaces you're creating for people to have those types of honest conversations. So, so important. So I want to talk for a moment about accessibility. You have a lot of veterans visit your farm. And of course, many veterans like yourself sustain injuries during their service, and as a result may have physical limitations or disabilities. What kinds of accommodations or adaptations do you make at your farm for individuals with physical disabilities?
Well, because we both deal with physical disabilities on a daily basis, accessibility is always at the forefront of our mind. So we have been working with the National Agribility Project for the last 10 years on developing accessible technologies for beekeepers specifically. So not only do we work with them at the national level, we work with them very closely at the local level. So when we designed our apiary, one of the things that we're very aware of, the fundamentals, so like things like tripping hazards, so making sure that we're on flat level surfaces so that mobility devices can work very easily there, making sure you have an ADA accessible toilet, making sure you have a ramp if you have a building that has a step, making sure you have a ramp that goes into that. So we incorporate all of that into the apiary and everything that we do. But it goes even a step further because most of my injuries are related to back and knee and ankle injuries and in addition to spinal injuries. The thing that we're always dealing with is the physicality of working bees. Working bees on Langstroth hives, which are like the US standard hive, is a very physical activity. You're constantly lifting heavy boxes, moving them. It is tough on the body. And so we're constantly looking for technologies that allow us to deal with those accessible options. So what we also have on the farm, in addition to the traditional Langstroth hives, we have Slovenian Aja hives, which you never have to lift a box. The most you ever lift is a single frame. We have long hives. We have Kenyan top bar hives, things that you don't have to work vertically, but rather you work horizontally so that there's less lifting. We also have adaptations on one of our Kenyan top bar hives where it actually tilts so that somebody seated in a wheelchair can actually roll right up to it, tilt the hive towards them, and work that from a seated position. So we're always looking for the newest technologies to allow individuals with all sorts of disabilities to work with these. As long as you have usage of an arm, or even if you have amputations and are using prosthetics, you can keep bees. When I was in Slovenia, we were working with the Paraplegic Beekeepers Association. And so they have a whole association for paraplegic beekeepers that have all these amazing technologies that they've developed for accessibility because that's what they're focused on. And so beekeeping is for everybody.
So much great information there. And yet another way that you're supporting veterans and others to make beekeeping accessible. Thank you for that. So let's pivot a bit. And I know you're relatively new to the Care Farming Network, But can you talk a little bit about why you decided to become part of CFN and why you feel it's so important to be part of a community of care farmers?
One of the reasons why we became part of the Care Farming Network is because we recognized very readily that these are individuals that are doing a lot of the same work we are, and coming together around this work to share ideas, to share expertise. There's only benefit that can come from that. And so that's one of the things that really excites both of us about being part of the network is this idea of sharing ideas, sharing passions, and really making farming accessible to everybody, because I think that's really important. The value of working with the land is tremendous. And so if we can all come together and recognize the importance of ourselves being part of nature instead of exclusive from nature, that just brings wellness to everybody. And so I think that's what we're really excited about.
And I know they're really happy to have you. So, Adam, Lacey, we are out of time. But before I let you go, how can people find out more about Be Wise Farms?
Yeah, bewisefarms.com is the easiest way. We have all of our contact information there, as well as a lot of information about what we do, and it's the easiest way to get in contact with us.
Lacey, Adam, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a really interesting conversation. I will never think of bees the same way again, thanks to the two of you. And I just really, really appreciate your time, your stories, and everything that you do.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for having us. We really appreciate it.